engineer. I was did software engineering, led teams, uh, did a program management role. Then I'm in a product management role. So did lots of work. And what's been fun for me is that I've got to work basically on the entire software stack. You know, how do you make software accessible from the base of APIs to how do you build the interaction model, whether it's magnifiers or screen readers and other technology. And then more recently, really spent quite a bit of time working in the teams on Microsoft Teams. And specifically, I spent quite a bit of time both with our design team and our research team to really look at how do we enable an understanding of what I refer to as a comparable experience. So whether you're blind or deaf or whatever your disability is, how do you make sure what you are capable of doing that we can ensure a system has, you know, a similar, what I call comparable experience, meaning about the same time and same satisfaction to complete tasks. And that takes a lot of design work, takes a lot of research work, and then it takes time to get all that stuff implemented. So that's the summary of my kind of academic into employment career. And then as a side gig, I've been working on making electronic music instruments accessible for those who are blind, colorblind, and low vision. And hopefully later this year, I'll have my first product coming out, and then a series that will follow suit. And so that's my side gig for fun. If I'm not doing that, I like to travel. So there you go. But happy to talk through anything. There's quite a bit of stuff in there, so happy to take questions and talk through different parts from research to design to whatever you want to talk about. Why I started to do a random side job to make music instruments accessible, like open to any of that.
Well, I'll start, but feel free to pop in other folks. So, as a musician myself, I'm very interested in this musical instrument thing. So, what instruments are you targeting like specific instruments, or like are you kind of thinking more like holistically as like like as a musicianship?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So um, I have always been interested in music and music production and then I was using a bunch of little groove boxes. This company called Electron makes these little groove box devices. And what happened is about 6, 7 years ago, I had some cataract surgery, and the cataract surgery led to retinal detachments. I had retinal reattachment surgery, and so it had a significant impact on my eyesight. And so I could no longer read the screens on these little groove boxes. And I was like, oh man, this sucks. And so I had a bunch of people that tell me like, oh, maybe have you tried X? Have you tried Y? I'm like, yes, but I just want to sit down and make music. And so all the things were very complicated and cumbersome. And one of the things about music, you just want to sit down and just jam. Like that's what I want to do anyway. And so what I started with is I wanted to decide how do I build an accessible sequencer.
Mm. Okay.
And so then at the time I was working with what's called a Eurorack system. If you've ever dealt with a synthesizer, it's basically like you take all the parts of a synthesizer, you turn it inside out, and you can have cables to connect anything to anything you want. So it's a super fun, hands-on way to do um, synthesizer work and whether it's drums and voices and all the cool things you can do with synthesis. But the one thing that didn't work well is there was no good accessible sequencer. So I started there because it's kind of a niche market, a really friendly market. And so I've been learning how do I build electronics? How do I take electronics to market? How do I like do all the things that are required to ship hardware? And it's a very different world from software. But I've been fortunate. A good friend of mine's been doing hardware and embedded hardware systems for 30 years. But my goal is really to start in a place where I could make sequencing accessible, but I wanted to do it in a way that anybody could use the device. And so one of the things about this device is that as you press a button, it'll tell you what it's going to do. So in a sequencer, you'd select a track and then you would turn on a step. And so you tap track select and you would turn it and it would speak to you what track you're on. You would tap the step button and it would tell you you're in step mode. And as you turn the knobs, it would tell you whether the step's on or off. And as part of this, they're just audio files that sit on the device. And so I built like 70 plus languages. So as people would show up in the booth, by the way, when I say show up in the booth, I was in Berlin 2 weeks ago at one of the largest electronic music expos, both for just if you ever get a chance, you like electronic music, you like electronic instruments, it's called Super Booth in Berlin. Probably one of the coolest shows because it's got about every electronic instrument manufacturer there, from small boutique to the large manufacturing. They have a bunch of concerts, so super fun little place to go. But anyway, so at that show, people come up and I'm like, "Hey, tell me your native language," and I would just flip it to their native language. They're like, "Oh my gosh, this like speaks literally my language." Um, and then it has full color RGB LEDs, and I did that because most people don't recognize that 4 to 5% of the male population is red green colorblind. Yet the majority of the LEDs on devices are red green flashing, and they're like, "Thanks for the flashing LED. Doesn't tell me anything." And so several people come up, and they're like, "Oh man, I'm colorblind." Like, yeah. And I said, "Look, you can pick any color you want." So a little web app you plug in, you can make any color you want. I said, "Hey, you may want any color you want because your style is shades of blue. Cool, you can make it look like shades of blue, or you functionally need it because that's just how your eyesight works." And so what would happen is people would show up and they have this, they'd be like, "Oh, you make it inclusive. What does that mean?" And so they'd start listening to it and they're like, "Oh, actually, this is really cool because if I'm on stage performing, I could just put the audio output into the cue in my ear, and now I know exactly what I'm doing on stage. There's no question about what I'm doing as I'm progressing through my performance. I know what track I'm on. I know what pattern I've loaded. I know what bank I loaded it from. I'm like, oh man, this is great." And what I loved about that is the intent was to show the music industry that something could be built, and it wasn't really that complicated. It's like, what do you need to know to do the engineering? So what I found is people were showing up in the booth. They're like, "Oh, this is great. It works for me. It's more flexible for me." And I'm like, yes, that's what happens when you think about inclusion and the design aspects of inclusion. And I think one of the things I'd like to be able to do in the next couple of years is really kind of write out the guidelines of how did I come to the conclusion of what I built, because I think um, when you start writing those out, you kind of put those in the open source community, you start sharing them, they take on a very different life than just say, "Here's the piece of hardware." So it's a really long version of saying summary, just a really unique boutique sequencer, and then I have plans to actually kind of widen that out into a range of instruments over time.
Yeah. No, I love what you said about, the fact that when you build things to be inclusive, it kind of helps everybody and provides functionality not just to the folks that need it to be inclusive, but also folks that are, fully sighted and fully hearing. It provides other features as well. And so I really like that idea.
Yeah,
Um,
it was just fascinating to watch people respond to it too, like, "Oh my gosh, this is great." So it's nice to have that kind of validation, I'm fortunate because of the amount of work I do in my day job. It's kind of natural, and even those smaller things like the speaking any language. The thing about shipping software at a global scale is you have to think about globalization, but most manufacturers don't. Something will be written in English, it'll be an English manual, and if it speaks, it'll speak generally English or wherever the language is that the device is built, but primarily in English for instruments. And so just the honestly, like, several people are just smiling. They're like, "Oh my gosh!" Like, French couple came up, they're like, "Oh my gosh!" A Swedish guy came. He goes, "Yep, that's definitely Swedish." So
yeah.
it was fun.
Hey, Chris, you want to ask you a question? I saw you put one in the doc.
Yeah, go ahead if you want to read it.
Oh, okay, sure.
Okay.
So this is from Chris. He says, my team uses MK Docs, moving to Zensicle. You familiar with that, Brett?
I'm not.
Okay, MK Docs is like a it's like a documentation framework. You get to put things in like text, and then you run it through MK Docs, and it makes this nice web page version of it.
Hmm,
And it has some accessibility plugins as well. So, um,
nice.
yeah, he says use MK Docs, moving to Zensicle. That's like the next version. What general comments do you have about making documentation accessible?
Boy, that is an awesome question. There's a few things that kind of this ordered list of things that goes through my head. Um, we're talking about I'm going to use the phrase static document, meaning I'm handing you a document to be read. And it's an important distinction versus editing. So I'll just talk about creation and publication of a static document. Um, the first challenge is just order. So if anybody's dealt with PDFs, PDFs can be in random order, really tough for a screen reader. So like if you're going to go to PDF style, you really have to understand what's going on when that stuff goes into a PDF. And there's two versions of a PDF. Well, three. There's just a static image, and then there's all the random stuff in it, PDF, and there's what's called a tag PDF, meaning it has the accessible information, so reading order and everything is correct. And that's probably less than 1% of most documents published. But regardless of what's going to the web or to PDF, really does the reading order laid out well? Do you have the headings laid out well? And the next problem you start running into are images, especially also in academic papers, you're going to get into math. Those are also significant challenges. But images are interesting because oftentimes people, let's give an example. When I was looking at some data one day, they would go, a chart of weather over a given set of days. Like that would be the alt text for someone who's blind. You're like, yeah, I probably got that because you probably got that from reading the context of the paragraph before it and after it. It doesn't tell you anything useful about what's in the chart, is it? A trend of rain over the past 12 years in the Seattle area, and then is it roughly trending up, down, or flat? You know, and so it's very easy to go, oh yeah, well I described it's about weather. You're like, okay, but it's not really what it's about. It's about the very specific data. Now, what's really fun for me anyway is that if you start prompting some of the AI tools, they can do a really phenomenal job of describing these things, and I can come back to that in a minute. But certainly images, if you get into things like flowcharts are really tough to make accessible. And so I often suggest people to go, hey, can you actually write it out in a list, an indented list, and kind of what that flow looks like. And then when you get into, I think, Patrick, I think you had a picture on your slide deck where there was a bunch of, like a circle with some circles that were kind of outside of it. How do you describe that in a meaningful way? And so I think what happens is it's really easy to go glance at them and you go, cool, that makes total sense. How do you describe that back out to someone? And then again, math is a unique challenge. There's a bunch of work being done right now by the DAISY Consortium and some other folks to really help math be more accessible right now. And then you get into unique challenges around footnotes and jumps to indexes, like those become a challenge. So yeah, those are kind of some of the top things that come to my mind. And I think one of the things that's most interesting to me about images and charts and graphs is that oftentimes, if you're careful about your language, you can describe it without actually needing the chart, and the chart becomes secondary. Most individuals use the chart as the primary and hope people extract the right information from it. And I talk about this in a different way because of my low vision, I'd often be in meetings or on calls. People go, as you can see by this. I'm like, well, I actually can't, so I don't know what you're pointing at. And what I've often spoken to people about is by the time you say the phrase, as you can see by this, you could have just said what the thing is. On June 12th, there's a dip in satisfaction or whatever it is you're talking about on the chart. And so if you actually learn how to just speak about, here's the thing, it's usually about a sentence long. And then the chart just supports it. And so we tend to think about that in the reverse way if you come from a sighted background. But what actually happens is you become a more effective communicator by summarizing it into a sentence, because someone could look at that chart. And if you all have ever been in any review with your peers, you can put a chart there and you can have 20 different people take 20 different things from it. And now you're having all these side conversations like, no, it's just this one thing I want to talk about. Like, yeah, but I know this anomaly over here. And now you're down a rabbit hole versus just staying focused on what you want to stay focused on. So I tend to really encourage people to dig into the image. What's the one or two sentences you're really trying to say? State that, and always state it even before you show the image, even if you're giving a presentation, because then people will stay focused on what you want to stay focused on. I don't know, is that helpful? Those are kind of the top things that come to my mind. Then you get into color and contrast and a bunch of those things as well. I can't tell you how many websites I've gone to, and they're like, I like this nice light blue on a dark blue background that is really low contrast. Uh, I think that's probably the next thing that comes up quite a bit is just contrast challenges. So,
There's a question in chat. We have an app to make PDF files accessible and have challenges with math problems recognizing, latex.
oh yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for possible solutions, or is that an open challenge?
Ooh, that is, I'm not an expert in LaTeX math. I do know there are tools that will convert that to something. What's it? It's called MathCat, something like that. That's one of the partners that folks are working with to make that accessible. Yeah, math is just it's a challenge, especially when you get past basic fractions. How do you describe it? It is far more visual than people um, give it credit. And I think one of the biggest challenges about math, even if I could, there are great ways to read math and from a literal sense, like you know, integral to x, you know, x to y, 1 over x dx, blah blah blah. You can have that read, but having it read to you versus physically understanding what's inside the integral, what's under the denominator, what's like physically understanding that relationship is really hard when someone just reads it to you. And so spent quite a bit of time trying to talk to people about how they manage it. I was talking to one student who's fully blind. He goes, actually just had some folks convert it into Excel, into the cells, so it was spatially the right way. And I thought that was a fascinating way for them to actually understand the spatial relationship. So math is something that is an ongoing area of research for those who are blind. Super challenging problem.
Great. Andy, you had a question?
Well, I just wanted to comment that we generally do pretty well with LaTeX and online. But Overleaf, for example, is a good web-based platform that's accessible. And kind of minimizes the amount of LaTeX you have to know. The setup stuff. But we did have a situation just recently with a student who had been using LaTeX throughout, and it's readable. It lays it out in a way that's relatively understandable if they can deal with parentheses, of course, because there's like many levels of things inside of things. That's probably the main challenge.
Yeah.
But they were taking an exam. The exam was in person for most students, just written paper exam. The student, of course, couldn't do that, and so we set up a laptop with a uh, uh, tech studio to use the LaTeX to lay it out, and turned off the internet on that laptop for them to use during the class exam.
It's interesting because one of the things that I was fortunate, I worked with my university for my last 2 years in college, and I actually shifted. I would do an oral exam with the professor. I could literally sit down and have lunch and we talk through it and go through things. And what was super fascinating for me is that I would study with a couple of friends of mine, and she'd be like, "Man, you should be getting A's in these classes." And I said, "No, you misunderstand. I understand how to use the things, when to use them, why you would execute them. Moving with the symbols is actually what you're getting graded on, and that I'm not good at." And so I think I just have a personal, point of view on math. I think that the interesting thing to me about math is that what I found in college is that most folks didn't know when to apply equations, but they could execute the equations. Where I sat on the other side, where I knew how to do, I knew when, where, and why, and how to do the concepts well, because that's just how my brain works. But executing the pieces of math, I was not great at, and because it was just visually a unique challenge. And so I found that my grades went up quite a bit because two things happened when I talked to my professor. They go, "Oh, you actually understand when, where, why, and how you'd use it, and you can articulate it really well." And then we talked through the execution of what I do and what the tricky pieces would be. And so it turned out to be at the end of the day, again, this is just my personal experience. the professor seemed to wanted to make sure you understood when, where, why, and how, and the execution was important, of course. So I found it interesting that I've always been curious if we always teach math the right way. It's always taught one way in the majority of how I think about it. So I was just kind of have this opening thesis on are there better ways to engage people in math? Because honestly, I'll just be very open. I was horrible at math. I took Calc 1 and I took Calc 1 and I took Calc 1. And I got to Calc 2 and I'm like, wait, I took Calc 2 and it's replaced all of Calc 1. Why did you do this to me? So, but I loved later math. I really loved linear algebra, diffie-q, got it, into the higher math. I'm like, oh, I get to solve problems. So I was like, oh, this is awesome. I wish someone could have started with the problems I'd get to solve. I would have learned math very differently. So I always feel like there's this interesting balance in how we teach math today versus do we lose students because we teach it in a different way? Because how we expect people to execute. And especially today, I don't know most people who sit and hand execute equations in the real world. So I don't know. It's just my personal thesis on that. And because I was, and just one more ironic to me anyway, is that I was really good at math. I was really good at geometry. I was put into advanced math, and then they immediately had me work by myself and I started failing. And then suddenly I was labeled as a bad math student. So I've had this up and down with math in the course of my career. So anyway, it's a super fun topic, and the reason I've been engaged with it, it's not part of my day job, but just as a side thing at work, is that I took some time to analyze sixth grade curriculum, period, just sixth grade curriculum. And I just asked a simple question. I go, how much of this can somebody who's blind do independently? And I did that, and when I was talking to people, I said, why did you ask the question that way? And I said, well, if you look at math, very, very complicated, but then you have to be able to understand a line on a chart. And then if a line on a chart, if you can't understand that, it probably means you can't understand lines on a map, so now you're talking about geography, geology, history has maps. Like you go through all these things where it starts to break down across the education and all of the classes you've taken in sixth grade. I said, what you teach that sixth grader is they are 100% dependent on somebody to be successful in life. And you teach them the wrong thing really early in life. And so I have been on this side quest at work once in a while, talk about how do we make math better? How do we make, engaging this content better? Because it's a very different mindset because you come out of, it takes a lot to get through high school. And if you have help all the way through, you're like, man, am I going to college? Like that's a whole other tough problem. That's a whole different transition because your level of support changes dramatically when you go into university. And so I just often think about, how do we just solve the basics so people can be independent? And I think we would change that because, there are really well done initiatives to bring people with different disabilities into STEM and just careers in general. And I just look back to the pipeline. I'm like, you could start losing them as early as sixth grade because the tech doesn't do what we need it to do. So it's probably a longer conversation on math than y'all wanted.
That's it. I found it very interesting. That's great. Mike, you had a question?
Not as such, more of a, Pandoc is my Swiss Army knife of file format to file format. And if MathML is more accessible, which I think that South Carolina page indicates that it is, then I would at least strongly consider using that as the way to get less PDF content out of LaTeX.
Yeah, and that is the nice thing. Like when you get to MathML, there are certainly more tools that will read for those who are blind. Still the structure is a challenge. Like I think I can't remember who made the comment earlier, but parentheses inside parentheses inside parentheses. You're just like, oh my gosh.
And I don't know if Andy actually replied back to Dusty's question of what tool they were using.
Yeah,
It's
a tough area. So yeah, and I appreciate the questions on it. I wish I were more of an expert in that space. It's just that's I'm an expert in how to do design and communications apps these days. That's been my last 5-6 years. So,
Dusty, your question?
Yeah, I hope my question on math didn't bring anxiety to anyone. But that's been one of our huge challenge. Another area that is a challenge for us is in the College of Music, sheet music. So we have our students who constantly print out sheet music for various different classes. And one year we said, hey, let's just go digital, give everyone giant iPads. But we noticed that the software was not accessible in terms of the sheet music that's when it's read out and followed.
Mhm.
So any thoughts around that or any experience around that?
I was fine because, man, I'd love to go fix that. Like that, I think there's so many fun things. Like I played a trumpet, and I've just memorized the music is how I solved my problem. I couldn't sight read anything, which is why I never people were like, hey, can you sight read this? I'm like, I cannot and will not. So I think so the reason I think there's a lot of interesting pieces to it is that with the device I'm building, it has scales, and you have to read to folks' notes and some other pieces, and so I think there are certainly ways to build that. I think it depends on the instrument too, because part of it that I've always thought would be more interesting, especially with the tech today, is to slow it down so you're playing with the system. So you would hear the tone that you're supposed to hit. For example, if I'm playing a trumpet or a wind instrument. And then it could also listen to the tones that you're playing. And so you might do it at, say, half speed just to walk through it and tell them what's going on. And you're not really necessarily having to read the music. You can still show the notes and music on the screen, but you can also just simply say it and play it. And they could, as they're playing it, you give them very specific feedback on, oh, it's this note or that note that you just hit. And so I think to me, it's not about how do I make it read a piece of sheet music. I think it's how do you change that around so you're helping someone learn in the way that's best for them. They're going to be, an auditory learner. You can tell them a note. You could then even adjust it like, well, what's the instrument you're playing? Here's the fingering for the note. And then if you're looking at tone and analyzing tone as they're playing, well, now you just made, it goes back to maybe that inclusive conversation from earlier. Now you just made an app that who doesn't want to learn that way? You just increase the ways in which you can bring information in and hear the information and interact with the information to learn faster. Especially if you got an iPad, like you just put a little earbud in to the side of your iPad and you play all day long, and it's just talking to you while you're sitting there. It's listening to what you're playing and just giving you feedback as you're playing. Like these are systems that could be built, especially with iPads today. So in my music work, side stuff I want to do music, I looked at there's this interesting DJ app called VDJ, and the reason I bring it up is that they built custom AI models that run on your iPhone today. That usually when you DJ, you'll cut bass or treble and mix things together. But they built very specific algorithms where you could say, just give me the drums, just give me the vocals, just give me the. So they had some very sophisticated algorithms so you could mix music in a very, very different way. And so like the ability now to train these systems and put something on an iPad that could just talk to you about what notes next and analyze what you're reading and how you're playing. And I think is certainly within reach without question at this day and age. So I think my thought is always about how do you help the person engage with it with their strength, and their strength will be listening.
Great, thank you.
But an immediate answer I don't have, so I apologize.
Any other questions? I have one that I've been I put down here in my little note stack that so you talked about this idea of comparable experience, and I think like when a lot of us think about accessibility, we think about meeting ADA requirements, and we have like a tool that we can put a web page through, and it tells
Yep.
us where we're like delinquent in the ADA requirements. And I feel like that's probably not what you're talking about when you say comparable
That's not.
experience. And
Yeah.
so could you maybe kind of just riff a
Yeah.
little bit off like comparable experience versus like meeting the technical requirements?
100%. So there's compliant and there's usable. I could make a house that is compliant. You could walk in and the doors make no sense, the stairways make no sense, but it could be compliant. It doesn't mean everyone will live in it, walk in it, or be there. So I often kind of try to put that in the physical space. And so what I've been working on and why I've worked so heavily both with our research and design team is that to build a comparable experience, what are the design rules, not the compliance rules? And so we always talk about efficient, predictable, and clear. Those were our three design rules. So now you give a task. The task is I open Teams, I'm going through my chat list, and I want to, well, what are the most common things you do next? You go read the chat from the oldest unread message. So you can just read down the list and catch up, and then you can decide if you're going to reply or you might go to the next chat. And all those things are really quick and easy with the mouse. But if you're using a keyboard, well, how do you do that? So now you have to think about, okay, when I down arrow to a chat, I need to take some action that will take me to the oldest unread message in that chat list. Well, we chose the space bar. So you press the space bar, we'll just move focus there. So whether I'm using a magnifier or a screen reader, focus is taken where I need to. I just down arrow through it. To get back to the list, you just press escape and go back to the list. Now, I could make that, it was technically compliant before, but you'd have to do like 28 tabs to get to the right place. Maybe shift 26 tabs if you went the other way. Like, it was compliant, but nowhere close to anything that was reasonable to use on a daily basis to bring the system down to something where I'm not spending more of my time listening to I'm on the right tab stop versus the content that I need to consume. And so we really took the time in the application to go, and the thing is, there's so many things you take for granted when you have sight and a mouse, and you really have to stop and kind of slow down. And I was talking about it. It's like doing a slow motion video. You gotta go, okay, wait, what am I doing in this frame? What I'm doing in the next frame? What I'm doing in the next frame? Because it's so automatic in your head. And then you go, okay, great. What am I really doing? I'm really going, what am I trying to accomplish? What am I doing to get there? And then you have to ask those two questions at each frame. And you go, oh, great. There's probably a better way we could do this faster for someone with a keyboard. And I always start with keyboarding ahead of screen reading because there's lots of people just love using a keyboard because they're just faster at it. So if I'm going to make a keyboard really efficient, again, I like the word efficient, then I'm going to make somebody who uses a screen reader really efficient. And there's other ways that you have to, also tame the content that gets read by a screen reader most of the time. But really start with that efficiency thing, and it goes back to what am I doing in the app? What am I trying to do first and foremost every time I'm there? And how to make that as efficient as possible. Okay, great. Now that we have it efficient, I can make sure it's predictable. Every time I repeat the same actions, I'm getting the right output from it. All right. And then is it clear what's going on? So from a screen reader point of view, you're hearing the right things. Visually, are you seeing the right things? So you kind of unpack these three words, efficient, predictable, and clear. You talk to designers, they're like, oh, we're just making good software. I'm like, exactly. And what do you ground it in? You ground it in what are the top tasks you got to get done? So that's how we think about it, because otherwise you can look at WCAG's got a long list, massively long list of compliance, but it doesn't necessarily yield the result that it yields the entry into a space, but it certainly doesn't make sure that they're getting stuff done in a similar time as their peers. And that's really the net drag that we would see. And that does come back to research. If you historically look at research with folks that have disabilities, particularly in the blindness space, what will happen is there might be 40, 50 things that everybody does every day. And they'll commonly take the first 10 and say, oh, look, they got through the first 10, we're okay. I said, that's actually not accurate. You need to make sure that there's 50 things people need to do, that the person who's blind is going to do all 50. And then you got to put it in the same time box. I said, because that's the daily reality for someone. I said, so now if they're only getting through 12 now of the 50 in the same time box it took someone to get through 50 items, there's a massive lag for that individual. So how do we start closing that gap? And so what you find if you start taking a very close look at these rules, their intent is to get you in the door. Nothing's been written well around how do you make sure that you get to that comparable experience, because that's the drag that folks feel every day. And it's not just one app, it's every app, and it's this compounding, massively compounding thing. So let's just go back to a web page. I can get through it. Okay, now I got to an image that wasn't quite good. So now I got to figure out, okay, what is the image really trying to tell me about the chart? Okay, I got that. Okay, now I got the math. Now I got to figure out LaTeX. Okay, oh wait, I got to convert LaTeX to MathML because the tool I've got reads MathML better. I'm spending more time than anybody else just trying to get to the content and patching other tools so that I can get to the same outcome as my peers. And you end up with a much larger net drag. And it's a compounding problem. It's a real thing. That's one of the reasons when you talk with folks that have been in industry for a while, and they're just like, I'm just exhausted every day because I got to go do more work than everybody else around me. And a lot of it's just tedious stuff. You're just like, oh, my screener didn't work the right thing. Oh, what do you mean it's 4 tabs a day and not 3? And then you're just like, and what happens, and the reason I say this as well is that you have to consider how memory really works. This is what it comes down to for me. You only have so much short-term memory, and you have to compile that into a coherent thought that you can keep in your head. If you are now using a screen reader, you've got 1 or 2 pieces of your short-term memory being used to track state, what's going on. Then once that hiccups, now you're in a different mode where you're trying to recover from a screen reader not doing what you needed to do. Now that's consuming more of your short-term memory. Now how to get back to stay focused on the thing that I'm trying to learn. It's a really fascinating compounding problem. It's an area where I wish people do a little more research on just the cognitive impact of people using this, because it's not just blind, slow vision, but it's anytime you interrupt somebody in that learning process, you also run this risk of where you go from you're in the learning mental state, like your brain is, in that chemistry space, in that to now I'm frustrated. It flips the chemistry in your brain, and now you're not absorbing what you need to learn. And so there's this that I haven't seen any research done in that area. So to me, there's just this fascinating reality of short-term memory, being able to string together thoughts in your head, and then when you get frustrated, it switches how now you're trying to consume data. Now you're frustrated. So it's a super interesting balance, and the sad part is it's not spoken about a lot, because when I talk with folks about it, they'll go, meaning people who are blind, they'll go, I agree, so when I talk about it more, they go, I'm concerned because will it impact my career if I talk about the challenges? So it's a super interesting space where I love for people to be able to do more research and really kind of understand those pieces. So that was a really long answer. I apologize. But it does come back to how do you go from compliance to something that's a comparable experience? It is about the discipline of the design team to walk through the core scenarios and go, how do we make this, if it's 1 or 2 clicks away, how do you make it 1 or 2 keyboard shortcuts away? And then you have to help folks be trained on how to use it.
Yeah. So if anyone has a question, please speak up, and I don't want to dominate my conversation, but when you were talking, Brett, it really reminded me of designing software just generally. Like a lot of times we have these requirements and we put them in, and then we try to, the user tries to use what we designed. It's horrible. And so, we have this, if everyone's in software, you've probably heard of like eating your own dog food, right? Using your own technology on a daily basis so you can understand the pain points. And so like just putting the data out there in some format that's unusable it's compliant, but it's not usable. And so when you were talking, I really thought about it, it really kind of rang true to me that, yeah, you need people to like try it and use it. If you have a keyboard shortcut, but it requires, 20 taps of tab to get it to work right, like that's not, super great. So, yeah, that really rang with kind of my background in software development, that you have to use things and, like I said, eat your own dog food to understand, that things can't just be compliant or, functional, they have to be usable as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why I spent so much time with the design team, because before you even had bits committed to a drive, if you will, if you just ask the question, is it efficient? You go, efficient for who? Well, somebody using a keyboard. And your design team goes, ooh, boy, that's not. Let's figure out how to do it. And so that's why really the last few years, I just had set out to find the right or at least not the right, a starting set of directives that we could unfold, or pillars, I guess, excuse me, pillars for design around efficient, predictable, and clear. And that was generated from our research. Like we had a ton of research, and we'd sit down and watch people use our product, and you're just like, oh my. And we just took their words. Like they're like,
Yeah.
we took the most top negative words and we said, how do we flip that to a positive? Oh, we need to be more efficient. We need this to be predictable. We need this to be clear. And so I thought if I could just spend the next 3 years just talking with the design team about those 3 words, and they go, well, efficient with what? A mouse. Efficient with what? A keyboard. Efficient with what? Clear with what? Or our visuals. Do our colors look good? Is it clear what I'm hearing when I'm using a screen reader? So when you do that, now you engage design teams. You're like, ooh, design language. I purposefully, this is what I want to be really clear about. I've spent 20 plus years in this space. I purposely stopped talking to any designer about anything about any requirements. I do not ask them to go read WCAG. I do not ask them to go read the longer set of internal Microsoft standards. I said, I need you to focus on what these 3 words mean. And why is that? Because if they did that, when they handed it to an engineer, we were bug fixes away from problems. We weren't rebuild of a product away from a problem. And so if I could remove from designers these really deep technical documents, because that is truly what WCAG produces, and I say, look, I just need you to focus on what you're great at as a designer. How do I just go through this efficiently with a keyboard? Like, cool, they'll get it. The engineers will then build it. And again, now you're talking generally small adjustments to get it better for a screen reader. How are you reading the data? Do you have the right data read? Hey, add a couple things to make the markdown read better. But now that's an engineering problem. The markdown is an engineering problem. The compliance rules are an engineering problem, not a design problem. And that's the shift that really helped our designers go, oh, I'm just making good software. And you really can't do that with good research, because you just take all the negative words and you flip them to positive, and then you go to your designers and go, how do we do this in order? And so I think that's been the biggest learning for me, honestly, in the last 20 years of doing this work, is how do you talk to designers? And how do you really leverage research in the right way to go, here's the true depth of the problem? And I say that because it's needed to have good research that shows the depth of the problem. And then you can say, here's your design language to solve the depth of the problem. Now you've got something you can hand to any engineering team, any leadership team across any company and go, depth of problem, design problem. Your engineers are super smart. You can go fix the gap. And so that's why it changed. That's why I wanted to really change the conversation in our organization about here's the gap, here's the design language. Let's just work on closing this over time. And I think it's been, yeah, so it's been fun. Anyway, you can tell I'm passionate about the topic.
That's great.
So, yeah.
No,
So,
we're coming on the top of the hour. Any last minute questions or?
I guess
Okay.
I
Go ahead.
just no, I just want to say thank you for the questions, Dave, because my just like the music one, like, man, I'd love to go solve that in a different way. I think sometimes we focus on here's how something's been solved. So how do we read a note to someone versus how to just help someone learn music? And I think that would be my encouragement to tell you when you're looking at these things, not just what the answer is today, but how do we just help anybody learn better? And I think that's the key piece about the inclusivity, which is you just maximize the ways in which you can interact with the content, spoken, written, hearing, interactive. You just help everybody, and then you're not really having an inclusion conversation. You're having a cool product conversation, and you tend to get better buy-in from the world about making a cool product. And by the way, you happen to be, thoughtful on the inclusion up front, so you close that gap in the right way.
Yeah, 100%. Well, thanks, Brett, for spending your time with us. I found this super interesting, and I see the comments other people did as well. So thanks again. Next month, June, we have Mike Benedito from our steering committee. He's going to lead a discussion on kind of tools to get us through these like crazy times. So, the Academy has seen some stressors over the last year. We've seen, hardware prices go up. We've seen funding for research go down, and a lot of new security, requirements getting put on us. And so Mike's going to lead a kind of a conversation around, the tools that some of us are using to get through these crazy times. And hopefully we'll get some tool ideas from all of you and resources. So not just technically, but also wellness and things like that as well. So we're looking forward for a really engaging conversation in June. So hope to see you then. Until then, take care all. Thanks. Thanks again, Brett.
You bet. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.